In the fourth section of this lecture, let's look at how social psychology developed by focusing on the contributions from Floyd Alport, Stanley Milgram, and Leon Festinger. Social psychology first began to emerge in the 1920s with Floyd Alport's work. But by the 1950s, it had established itself as a separate, distinct subfield of psychology. Social psychology is the scientific study of individual behavior in social situations. This field considers how people think, feel, and behave when surrounded by other people or when they perceive that other people's opinions, perceptions, ideas, thoughts, actions matter. Many modern historians consider Floyd Alport to be the father, the founder of experimental social psychology. He earned his PhD in 1919 from Harvard University, where he studied with Hugo Munsterberg, like so many other pioneers in the field. After graduating from Harvard, he published his famous social facilitation studies. He compared participants' performance on different tasks when they were alone and when they were in groups. What he found was when other people were present, his participants sometimes performed better than they did when they were alone. More specifically, when his participants were really good at a task, they did better when they had an audience than they did when they were alone. Take a moment to think about something that you are really, really, really good at. That thing that you have so much skill in is something that you could perform really well if you were alone. And according to Allport's research, his social facilitation research, you could probably perform that very same task even better if you had an audience, if you had people watching you. He published his social facilitation studies in 1920. Several years later, he published a popular textbook called Social Psychology. Universities across the country adopted it for their social psychology classes. It was used for at least 50 years and is now it was the #1 textbook for more than 50 years and was published in 13 different editions. Look at the edition of your history textbook. Allport's early work in the 1920s paved the way for other researchers to contribute to and grow social psychology. Leon Festinger is one of those individuals. He earned his PhD from the University of Iowa and studied with Kurt Lewin, one of the individuals who moved from Germany to the United States just before World War II. Festinger published his famous theory of cognitive dissonance in 1954. The basic premise of his theory was that all humans seek to maintain balance between their behaviors and their thoughts. If you believe you should exercise, then you exercise. If you believe you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't smoke, then you don't drink, you don't smoke. When there is alignment between attitudes and behavior, we have balance. When there is misalignment, when behaviors and thoughts do not match, he said the result is cognitive dissonance. This tension that we feel when we're aware our actions don't exactly match up with our thoughts, when we don't walk the talk, when we say something but do the opposite. In those situations, cognitive dissonance results and causes tension, causes this uncomfortable state of being. This tension then motivates us to do something about it, to restore balance in some way. There are multiple different options, techniques that humans use. Let's look at an example of cognitive dissonance and then look at some of the strategies people use to deal with the tension. In this example, you can see the behavior on the left and the cognition on the right. Imagine someone who drinks alcohol also knows that drinking alcohol can cause liver disease and other health issues. This conflict between drinking alcohol but knowing that alcohol is not good for the body, this conflict is what causes cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is the uncomfortable state. To deal with this conflict, one of the things we might do is change the attitude, change the cognition. So we might say to ourselves, drinking only causes problems for people who drink a lot. While that may not be true, the fact that we're now thinking it aligns more with our behavior and reduces that tension. One of the other things we might do is change our perception of our behavior. The first strategy is to change the attitude about the behavior. The second strategy is to change how we think about how we perform the behavior. For example, the person in this example might decide that they don't drink all that much. So this tension isn't a problem because their perception of their own behavior changes. The third thing we can do is minimize the number of options that we have available to us. So we might justify our behavior by saying something like, my friends gave me drinks all night. It wasn't me. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have any say in the matter. This happened to me. That is a way of reducing that tension. The fourth strategy is to minimize the importance of the issue. So instead of dwelling on the negatives of drinking alcohol, instead of feeling guilty, instead of feeling bad about it, we tell ourselves that the issue is not important. We only live once, might as well, let's have fun. Sometimes we do this, of course, even when the issue is important to us, when the issue is important to other people. So I encourage you, the next time you find yourself doing something that you know you shouldn't, think about which of these strategies is playing into your decision-making process. One of the reasons Festinger became so popular in social psychology was because he staged these elaborate experimental situations and relied heavily on deception in order to carry out the situation. He deliberately withheld information from his participants. Sometimes he lied to his participants, all in an effort to maintain the integrity of the experiment. Today, we would not be able to replicate Festinger's studies because it would violate some of the ethical principles we've established since the mid-1900s. In 1964, he quit researching because he got tired of listening to his critics bemoan his use of deception. By the 1970s, social psychology and deceptive experiments were closely tied to one another. Even the general public associated social psychology with things like Zimbardo's prison experiment and Milgram's obedience studies, which we'll talk about next. His work was also important because it helped promote social psychology's reputation as a legitimate science. He tried to increase the amount of control he had in his experiments. One of the things he did was measure a variety of variables, not just the variables of interest. When we analyze the data using statistics, we can control for those external variables. He was very careful about how he manipulated the independent variable. As I mentioned, deception was often involved in the process. He was also very careful about how he measured the dependent variable. He was also among the first generation of psychologists to rely on the ANOVA, the analysis of variance, as a way of evaluating the data that results from conducting a psychological study. We often have two groups, the group that we treated, the group that we didn't treat, and we need to figure out if the differences that we're seeing in the Excel sheet that we use today, back then it would have just been ledgers. We're trying to figure out if those differences between the two groups are meaningful differences. Did those differences happen by chance, or did those differences happen because there's something there, there's some phenomenon that we've been able to identify? In 1960, Stanley Milgram earned his PhD from Harvard University, where he studied with Gordon Allport, the brother of Floyd Alport. As a Jewish man, Milgram was influenced by the Holocaust and wanted to focus his research on the topic. In the 1950s, Osh had started studying conformity using his line length task. Milgram had what he thought was a better way of studying what he called obedience. He published the results of the initial study in 1963 and then conducted 17 more studies, which he published in a book in 1974. 18 studies in total. But the main question he was trying to answer with his first study was how much voltage would the teacher apply before disobeying the authority figure's orders? And I'll explain on the next slide how the experiment worked. His results demonstrated the power of the situation. The notion that sometimes we obey other people when we wouldn't otherwise do so. He was then interested in figuring out in which situations do we tend to obey and in which situations do we tend to disobey. You can see the tie back to the Holocaust. He was trying to figure out why some of the Nazi personnel obeyed their orders. Why didn't more of them disobey? Why did they not refuse to do what they were being asked to do? Like many of the other social psychologists' work in the 1960s and 1970s, his was criticized for his use of deception. He was not entirely honest with his participants, and some of his participants reported unsavory outcomes after participating in his studies. So what did he do to gain this kind of reputation? On Yale University's campus, he recruited 40 men to participate in his first study. The experimenter, who wore a fancy white coat that screamed degrees and authority, asked the participants, who were called teachers, to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to a student. Now, keep in mind, the student was a Confederate. The student worked for Milgram, and the student was never actually shocked. They pre-recorded screams and ouch noises like that so that they could standardize the research process. The teacher was supposed to be teaching the learner groups of words. When the learner got things wrong, the teacher was supposed to shock them with these shocks. Every time the learner got a question wrong, the teacher was supposed to up the voltage. Eventually, the teachers get to the point where the learner, which is just a pre-recorded voice, didn't actually happen. They eventually get to the point where the learner is screaming, "Help me, get me out of here. I have a heart condition, help." Milgram was interested in seeing just how far those teachers would go before they finally said to the experimenter, "I can't do it anymore. He has a heart condition. I can't hurt him. No, I'm not doing this. No, no, no." Well, you can see the results in the chart here. On average, 27 of the 30 total shocks were administered. So on average, most of the potential shocks were given. Even more surprising, 65% of the participants, the teachers, administered all 30 of the shocks, went all the way to the highest voltage possible, which means they heard the learner say, "I have a heart condition, I need help," and they still administered the shocks. After the experimental session, during the debriefing period, some of the teachers reported feelings of extreme guilt, sadness, anxiety. They did not have positive things to say about their participation in the study, what it felt like to be the teacher and to shock someone who had a heart condition. Well, this all begs the question, why? Why did these teachers continue administering shocks with the knowledge that the person they're shocking could die? Why? Milgram concluded it was because of the authority figure. It was because of that experimenter. In follow-up studies, when the experimenter did not wear a white coat, the results did not look as sad as they look here. People did not go as far as they did in the initial study. When he made the experimenter look less authoritative, less powerful, the results again changed. They were in the more positive direction. People disobeyed sooner. Through the 18 different studies, Milgram was able to explore some of the different situations in which people tend to disobey and people tend to obey. One of the most interesting things about this study is that it has been replicated within the ethical boundaries over time and across cultures. Stanley Milgram is best known for his obedience studies, but he did make several other contributions that I just had to show you. He created what we call the lost letter technique. It is a way of studying attitudes by measuring behaviors. He dropped 4 stacks of stamped envelopes in various parts of the city, waiting for people to pick up those letters, drop them in the mailbox, and send them off in the mail. The return address was his address. There was a stamp on the envelope so that all the individual had to do was drop it in the mailbox. He was interested in finding out the percentage of letters that would be returned. On each letter, there was one of 4 groups: medical research associates, friends of the Communist Party, friends of the Nazi Party, and an individual person. After waiting for several weeks and for the letters to return, what he found was very interesting. More than 70% of the letters that were addressed to the medical group or the individual were returned. Less than 30% of the letters addressed to the Communist Party or the Nazi Party were returned. He reasoned that the results reflect people's attitudes just as much as they do the direct behavior, the mailing of the letter, the picking up of the letter and saying, "Oh, I like that person. I'm going to help out these medical research associates and drop this letter in the mail." people who picked up the other letters and saw that they were addressed to the Communist Party or the Nazi Party did not drop those letters in the mail because they don't have positive attitudes toward those two groups. He also coined the phrase familiar stranger to describe those people that we know, that we're familiar with. Maybe we see them every day, but they're still a stranger to us. We don't know their name. We're not comfortable carrying on a conversation with them. For instance, maybe some of the people who live in your neighborhood, maybe you recognize their car, but you don't know anything about them. You just know what they drive and where they live. They would be a familiar stranger. They're relatively unknown to you, but you're familiar with them. He also studied the small world phenomenon. Many of us call it 6 degrees of separation. What he did was ask a person in Nebraska to send a letter to a specific person in New York City. But the trick was, the letter could not be sent directly to the person. They had to send a letter to someone they knew who might know that person in New York City. Now, for many of us, when we first hear this, we think that's impossible, it would never happen. But guess what? It did, time and time and time again. What would happen is the person in Nebraska would mail a letter to, say, a friend that lives in Missouri who went to New York 10 years ago. Nebraska to Missouri. The person in Missouri may not know the person in New York City, but let's say they have a friend in Chicago who travels there on business all of the time. So that person in Missouri would mail the letter to someone in Chicago. That person in Chicago might mail a letter to someone they met in New York City. Once it gets to New York City, it might just take 1 or 2 more people to make the connection. He did this multiple times with different participants. After he analyzed the data, he found that on average, any 2 strangers were only separated by 6 social connections. Between Nebraska, which is labeled A in this image, and the person in New York, which is labeled B in the image, there are 6 connections, 6 social connections. It's a small world.